Thank you for all coming back so promptly. You all remember the video, or those of you who were here at the beginning of the conference yesterday, when Bill Polk from the south of France sent his welcoming message. And Bill was the key architect for this conference and the inspiration of the ideas that have been presented here over the last 2 days. And it's with great pleasure that I'm inviting George Polk, Bill's son, to come up and introduce the paper that Bill sent and indeed included in the packets that you received when you got here. But I'd like George to come up and tell you a little bit about the paper.
Good afternoon. I have the coveted after lunch slot, which is always nice. And then I originally was instructed to read the paper, which is I'm not very good at in general. Just keeping to text isn't really my talent. But then the paper is rather longer than the 15-minute slot. So then I was told just to tell you that the paper was in your pack, which seemed like something I could just about handle. But then I learned 5 minutes ago that I should summarize it for you. So I'll give it a shot. That will be the end of my filial relationship with my father, to summarize his long paper in a few sentences. But I'll do my best. I guess I would start with the preface of saying, which has some consequence beyond just this paper and this conference. My father's a historian who has spent his life fascinated by the fact that not only, as many have said, we're destined to repeat the lessons of the past, but that we so regularly do. And having looked for historical antecedents for just about every modern crisis that he's encountered, he generally has been able to find a pattern in the past which proves out what's likely to happen in the present and the future. That's obviously been very frustrating to him, because he has at times felt a little bit like Cassandra sitting in the corner of the room, loudly proclaiming what he believed to be truth and not necessarily always listened to. And it's been particularly frustrating, I think, to him in the recent past around issues like the invasion of Iraq or the invasion of Afghanistan, the current crisis with Iran, and any number of things you could count in the last 15 or 20 years. Principally because he's come to believe, having served in government and having been outside of government, that force doesn't work terribly well. That force doesn't really take account of the human elements that make us into a society that in the end motivate us to do things that might not necessarily be logical. It's the great mistake, of course, that Hitler made in the Second World War, to think that you could bludgeon the British into submission. And what he didn't really realize is that with every bomb that he dropped, all he did was stiffen the resolve of his enemy. And I think you can say that plays out today. We have a very clever, targeted assassination approach in Afghanistan, and all that happens when we wipe out one person, and usually the 20 people sitting next to them, is that all the people who've ever met those people become our enemies. And I guess my first encounter of this was living in the Middle East when I was younger, and that was in the days when the Americans sent troops in to secure the Beirut airport, and we had battleships offshore. And every time that somebody, a sniper in a village overlooking the airport, would shoot at a soldier, usually missing, the battleships would shell the village. And the thought was, of course, that the villagers would turn out and get rid of the sniper. But we've all been in neighborhoods where bad things happen that we can't do very much about. And it seemed a little bit like a disproportionate response that was going to lead to trouble. So I think I'll walk you through very, very quickly this paper, and I won't dwell on any of the points particularly, but I think that the main point that he begins with is that historically people have always felt quite a strong hostility towards foreigners. And that hostility doesn't necessarily come from a rational competition over resources or an inability to share things. It comes from the fact that at one time or another we were all kind of together, we've all come from a common root, and that as we've separated and split ourselves up, we draw identity from our differentness, and that inevitably has led us to a much more hostile relationship towards foreigners. The first manifestation of this in defense terms was there was an ancient city called Jericho, and Jericho became known as the first city in which somebody bothered to build a large-scale wall. And of course, you only begin to build a wall when you have something to protect. So this was the beginning of the agricultural time. People had agricultural surpluses to protect. As he puts in here, the estimate is that each citizen of Jericho had to move about 50 cubic meters of rock and earth themselves without the benefit of any mechanical intervention to build this wall. So they obviously thought it was pretty important. The challenge, of course, is that building that wall then and building just about every wall we build now doesn't work very well. Historically, we now know from the record that Jericho had to rebuild that wall about 20 times during the course of its relatively long history. So although temporarily it was quite effective, in the long run, the forces of that are outside of your control, if they're truly hostile, will always overcome whatever wall you can build. The cost of trying to keep the barbarian away through building wall, of course, also then overwhelmed the societies, because people could no longer do the productive things that they wanted to do. And so the intangible cost of building a wall is that you also then begin to undermine your society. And of course, the modern example of that is the Soviet Union spending itself into ruin to try to match our now more current spending ourselves into ruin. I think so his phrase in here is common to all these efforts at achieving security in stone or concrete are two features. They were ruinously expensive and they did not work. The next logical step, if you build a wall and the defensive formations don't work very well, is to go out and get the guy who's coming to get you. And so where wall building failed, you then turn to a much more aggressive intervention and start to go to war. War is problematic because generally people have found, as the phrase he uses here, is no amount of ferocity brought peace or security. And then he goes on to say even genocide ultimately failed. And the challenge is that the problem with most of these things is it's actually very hard to kill off another people. And for two reasons. One of them is that there are often survivors, and those survivors hold a grudge, and then they begin to rebuild themselves. And in the long term, that creates instability. But also very often, some of the survivors intermarry into your society and create some kind of domestic political unrest. And of course, one of the big challenges, if you look at a big conflict today, like the Arab-Israeli conflict, there are an awful lot of Israeli Arabs who live within Israeli society. And how do you begin to deal with that? Then you begin to segregate within your own society, and that begins to pull your society apart. And so as he says here, in state after state, armies are blunt instruments, often yielded by the blind to bring about what was neither expected nor desired. And of course, one of the things that building large-scale armies inevitably brought about is you had to feed them and you had to pay them, and so you had to tax yourself. And so, as he points out, in 594 BC, the state of Lu was the innovator in taxing their own citizens to create an army, and of course that began an economic process which ultimately then undermined the state that it was trying to protect. And then, of course, what you try to do if you have an army and you're trying to defend yourselves against other people is you end up going towards total war, and whatever technological capability you have to project yourself into war, you go as far as you possibly can. And inevitably that has generally been what happened, something very frightening in our time because our concept of total war is a little bit more devastating. He then points out here that the Italians were, and there are examples of other people, but the Italians, more commonly known to all of us, were very disturbed by this pattern, and they tried to think of some way you could get around this. Machiavelli's The Prince is an attempt to create a diplomatic paradigm of how you might be able to control your enemies without having to go to war against them and without having to ruinously spend your own resources. There are many other examples of people in China and Middle Eastern Europe and so forth. But that was generally the sort of alternative strategy, was to try to organize your diplomatic resources or your soft power in ways that allowed you to control another society. I think he then goes into the sort of academic view of this, which emerged in the 40s and 50s in the United States, where we began to plan foreign policy. We began to think of things like the domino theory and very careful constructs of the way that the world was put together. And we began to do war games and other things which saw the world as a set of logical paradigms that we could play against. And that, of course, led us into Vietnam. And there were all sorts of very logical reasons why the Vietnamese shouldn't have cared that we wanted them to be free, and we wanted them to be free preferably under the French and to do whatever the French wanted them to do, because that should have been better. They would get a better education, better access to resources, and so forth. And anyway, we had overwhelming firepower, and we were clearly going to win. None of those things turned out to be true. And so the philosophical and academic approach to trying to plan how you might intervene into other societies also hasn't been terribly successful. And that then led to other attempts in the same time period to exercise power, which was to try to go through covert means to exercise power. If you didn't really want to go to all-out war and your diplomacy power games weren't really working, perhaps you could just undermine the other society in some sort of subtle way, ideally in a way that made it look like they were even doing it themselves, and that would lead to political change from within. And I think it's fair to say that we've seen many examples of that tried with varying amounts of resource investment, and generally that's failed as well. And I think to move away from the paper for a minute, I think that's probably one of the things that has most frustrated him, is to watch the growth of the resources devoted to this and to see how unsuccessful it has generally been. And you can look at Iraq, you can look at Cuba, you can look at lots of places where we've tried many, many, many different soft tools, covert, overt, war, et cetera, to try to change a regime, and by and large that hasn't been very successful. I lived in Guatemala and was a UN election observer in El Salvador, and you had very much the sense of picking up the mess that these policies had left over when everybody went home. And so I think that's really what led him ultimately to try to explore the themes of this conference, because ultimately he's come to believe that the only real way you get security is if you can in fact meet the legitimate needs of other peoples, and that there must be some way that you can that you can build a bridge to other peoples that buys you security without the ruinous expense and without the loss of life and the social disruption that comes from war by all of the various different means. And I think he's come to feel that particularly profoundly in the case of the United States now, because of the enormous amounts that we spend on our own military security, which arguably has left us not terribly secure. I was just, some of you know, I've been also keynoting at another conference today, and the other person who I've been with for most of the day was another former president of Costa Rica, but we have one here. And one of the reasons why the former presidents of Costa Rica are so widely respected around the world is that Costa Rica has managed to become a thriving society by saying we will not participate in the military experiment. And of course there are others who've tried that as well. So at the end of the paper, what he really tries to come to is to say the challenge is to really look into human, the human mentality and think about how, in, for example, Freudian analysis or other ways to understand how what our insecurities are and how we react to them and how we build societies out of that, to try to understand what makes people feel secure. And ultimately, as we all know, or those of us who've had children, being fairly new to the game, know that when you create a situation of security around people, they become much more productive, they become much more effective, they build bridges to other people much more effectively. Insecurity in the end only breeds insecurity. And I think what's been fascinating to him as a voyage, and he goes into a little bit in the paper, but not as much as he does in some of his other books, is that in fact when you take the philosophy and the theory of how you might create global security and you map that back to what we now know about the brain and about how our neurological processes work, the things that we're all talking about here about building a commonality of interest and engaging in the very real problems of the globe in a way that makes everybody feel better, will actually create true security. And it'll create a security which allow all of us to thrive, as opposed to a security which in effect undermines the societies which we're trying to defend. So that's my best attempt at summarizing the paper on the fly. None of it is mine. So
thank you, George. Excellent.
Not at all.
Very good.
Pleasure.
I'm rather glad I didn't give you more notice. But that was admirable, George. Thank you very much indeed. And the closing remarks, I think the sort of lesson that I think everybody is going to be taking away from here. And I commend the paper to all of you to read on your way home and to put what we have been hearing today in the historical context that Bill has provided.